Carol Burnett once said that laughter can heal, but even the brightest laughter can hide the deepest shadows. In the quiet corners of Hollywood, away from the applause and the cameras, she carried stories that no one dared to tell. Stories of love, loss, and a world that often seemed determined to crush joy beneath its glittering feet. The world knew her as a beacon of comedy, a woman whose smile could light up the darkest studio lot, yet behind that smile, there were moments that left her trembling, nights that left her weeping alone in her dressing room, clutching letters she could never send, and memories she could never share, until now. It began with a letter she received in the early 1970s, tucked beneath the mail of fan letters and scripts, a letter that would alter her understanding of fame and friendship forever. It was from a figure whose name carried weight across Hollywood, someone adored by millions, someone she had trusted implicitly. The words on the page were polite, almost cordial, yet beneath their surface, they carried a quiet, suffocating cruelty, a truth that would haunt her for decades. It spoke of betrayal, of promises broken, and of an incident that the tabloids would never touch but that left Carol feeling as though the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. She held that letter close for years, rereading it in solitude, the words like invisible hands pressing against her chest. In those days, she would walk the corridors of the studio late at night, past the echoing laughter of crew members and the distant hum of projectors, trying to convince herself that it was all part of the price of success. But inside, the pain gnawed at her. She thought of her family, her father, who had battled illness, her mother, whose strength was legendary yet fragile, and her brother, whose own missteps had left scars she still carried. Every choice she made seemed to reverberate with unintended consequences, pulling those she loved into shadows she could never illuminate. And there were moments, rare and fleeting, when the curtain of her public persona slipped, and her tears fell in ways no camera ever captured. Friends who had watched her rise, Lucille Ball, Dick Van Dyke, and even younger stars like Julie Andrews, noticed the change, the quiet tension behind her eyes. They asked gently if she was all right, offering a hand that she sometimes accepted, other times pushed away, terrified that letting anyone too close would shatter the fragile balance she had built. Carol's laughter on stage became sharper, almost offensive, a shield against the vulnerability that she could not yet speak aloud. And somewhere in the mix of applause and confetti, a tragedy unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, a secret illness in the family, the slow deterioration of someone she adored, whose last words were muffled by hospital machines, words that haunted Carol in her quietest moments. She began writing fragments in a leather-bound journal, fragments that told stories of hidden truths in Hollywood, of friendships tested by greed, of alliances that turned venomous, and of moments when power and fame eclipsed even the closest bonds. One entry spoke of a whispered conversation with Betty Davis on a stormy night in the hills above Hollywood, a conversation where Bet admitted a regret so profound that it shook Carol to her core. Another entry recalled a private dinner with Lucille Ball, where laughter came and went in waves, punctuated by confessions neither woman expected to share, and yet, somehow, the laughter always returned, even if tinged with tears. But even as she tried to process it all, the world kept watching, expecting joy and light. The cameras, the scripts, the live shows, they demanded a version of Carol that was unbreakable. And so he learned to carry the weight quietly, folding her heartbreak into jokes, hiding regret behind comedic timing, and letting the audience see only what she chose. Yet at night, when the lights dimmed and the laughter ceased, she would speak softly to the shadows, to the people she had loved and lost, and to the truths that could never fully escape her. Those moments, unrecorded, uncelebrated, were the ones that truly defined her, moments of honesty that she feared the world might never understand, moments she would carry for the rest of her life. The story that captured global attention, the one that eventually surfaced decades later, was not a tale of scandal or tabloid fodder. It was a story of human fragility, of love and betrayal, of laughter that masked deep sorrow. And as Carol reflects now, in the quiet of her home, the lines of age softening her features, she knows that the world only glimpsed fragments of her life. Yet the fragments she kept secret, the ones buried in letters, journals, and whispered confessions, hold the weight of an entire lifetime, shocking, heartbreaking, and profoundly human. Beloved Carol Burnett often recalls that the hardest truths are the ones no one else sees. In the years following her meteoric rise, a different kind of story began to take shape, one that was hidden beneath the laughter, behind the bright lights, and beneath the costumes that had made her a household name. It started with a phone call that came on a rainy afternoon in Beverly Hills, the kind of call that feels ordinary until the moment it changes everything. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost trembling, speaking of someone she had once trusted implicitly, someone whose charm had seemed larger than life, and yet, in a moment, that charm revealed a darkness that no one could have anticipated. Carol remembers how she clutched the receiver, her knuckles white, her breath catching as fragments of memory collided, late-night studio meetings, whispered promises in dressing rooms, laughter shared over champagne and scripts. The call spoke of an incident that had been covered up, of people who had vanished from her life quietly, and of choices made in the name of appearances that left real human lives in pieces. She felt a familiar weight settle in her chest, a mix of anger, grief, and the helplessness that comes when you realize that the world only sees what it wants to see, and the truth can be as invisible as a shadow at midnight. It was during this time that Carol began to reconnect with her family in ways she hadn't allowed herself to before. Visits to her father, who by now was frail and haunted by his own regrets, became more frequent. She would sit by his side, holding his hand, trying to reconcile the daughter she had been with the woman she had become. Her mother, ever the pillar of strength, had fallen into illness herself, and the worry that she might never get to tell her all that had happened pressed on Carol with unbearable urgency. She wrote letters she never sent, filled with confessions, apologies, and the things she feared she could never say aloud. And in those letters, there was one name that appeared again and again, the name of someone whose betrayal had shaken her foundation, someone whose charm and influence had allowed secrets to fester in plain sight for decades. The more she reflected, the more she realized that Hollywood, for all its glamour, was a labyrinth of concealed truths. She remembered evenings with Lucille Ball and Mary Tyler Moore, laughter echoing through private homes, yet under it all, there was tension, whispers of rivalries, jealousies, and hidden pain. She recalled conversations with Julie Andrews about the cost of fame, about the sacrifices made in the name of entertainment, and the quiet heartbreaks that no one wanted to discuss. Carol had learned that people could be incredibly generous, but also capable of acts that could wound deeply, leaving invisible scars that lingered far beyond the applause point. One evening, as she sat alone in her home, Carol reflected on the moments she had lost, friends who had passed, family members who had never fully understood the burdens she carried, and opportunities to speak truths she had suppressed. Tears came without warning, sliding down her cheeks as she realized that even as the world cheered for her comedic brilliance, the battles she fought in private were just as defining, just as profound. The laughter she gave others was real, but it had been built on foundations of quiet sorrow and long-held secrets, and then there were the moments of confrontation, moments that would define her understanding of courage and forgiveness. Carol had to face people whose actions had caused pain, some seeking reconciliation, others refusing to acknowledge the past at all. In those encounters, she saw reflected the complexities of human nature, the desire to be loved, the capacity for cruelty, and the unspoken truth that even the strongest laughter cannot erase suffering. Each conversation, each memory, was a brick in the structure of her later revelations, the story that would one day capture global attention, the story that no one could have predicted, yet everyone would remember. In the end, the world saw Carol Burnett as a symbol of joy and resilience, but those closest to her knew the depth of the sorrow she carried. They knew of nights when she would break down quietly, when letters lay unfinished, and when regrets weighed heavier than any spotlight ever could. And as she prepared to tell this story, the one that would shock and move millions, she understood that it wasn't just about fame or betrayal, it was about life, in all its heartbreak, complexity, and fleeting beauty. The laughter would remain, but now, it would be colored with the truth she had long kept hidden. Legendary Carol Burnett often says that the hardest moments in life aren't the ones the world witnesses, they are the ones that unfold behind closed doors, in rooms where no one else is allowed. In the late 1980s, a series of events began to unravel that would force her to confront some of these hidden truths head-on. It started with a visit from a longtime friend in the industry, someone who had been both ally and rival over the years. Their conversation began lightly, filled with reminiscences of sketch rehearsals and shared jokes, but then it shifted. There were hints, subtle but piercing, of incidents that Carol had long buried, incidents involving colleagues whose names she had only whispered in private journals, colleagues whose influence could make or break careers. The revelation hit her like a cold wind through the hills above Hollywood. It wasn't a public scandal, no cameras captured it, no tabloids reported it. But for Carol, it was seismic. She thought of those she had trusted implicitly, the mentors and friends whose guidance had seemed unconditional, and realized that some of that guidance had come at a cost she had only recently begun to measure. She found herself revisiting old scripts, old letters, and old recordings, searching for clues, trying to piece together moments that had once seemed innocent but were now laden with hidden consequences. Her family, of course, had their own struggles. Carol's mother had been battling a chronic illness, a quiet, unrelenting force that demanded every ounce of strength. Her father, already frail, had faced health challenges of his own, and the burden of caretaking weighed heavily on Carol. She often found herself torn between the demands of her career and the needs of her loved ones. One night, after a particularly grueling recording session, she returned home to find her father in the hospital, his last words a fragile plea for forgiveness, for understanding, for a daughter who had been both strong and absent in equal measure. The emotional toll was nearly unbearable, yet she pressed on, determined to honor both her family and the legacy of her work. Even her closest Hollywood friends noticed the shift. Lucille Ball reached out during one of Carol's lowest points, offering advice that was both comforting and brutally honest. Laughter, Lucille said, isn't just what you give to the world. It's what you must give yourself, or you'll drown. Carol took those words to heart, using comedy as both armor and release, but inside, the quiet moments of sorrow persisted. There were nights when she would sit alone in her living room, staring at photographs of family and friends who were no longer with her, and the tears would come unbidden, the kind of tears that leave a lasting ache in your chest. And then there were the moments when the shadows of Hollywood itself seemed to close in. Meetings with executives, agents, and producers occasionally revealed the sharp edges of ambition, the willingness of some to exploit, to manipulate, and to conceal. Carol discovered letters, contracts, and memos that hinted at decisions made behind closed doors, decisions that affected not just her career, but the well-being of those she cared about. The emotional weight of it all was staggering, yet she bore it quietly, determined to maintain her public persona while wrestling privately with the moral complexities of her world. It was during this period that she began recording her reflections, late at night, in a voice recorder she kept hidden. The recordings were raw, unfiltered, aired, and profoundly revealing. She spoke of regrets, of moments when she had been too trusting, of moments when she had not intervened, of the hidden pain she carried from losses that no one else acknowledged. She spoke of friends and colleagues who had shaped her life, for better and worse, and of the thin line between admiration and betrayal. Each recording became a lifeline, a way to process the tangled web of Hollywood, family, and personal heartbreak, and somewhere in the midst of it all, the story that would eventually capture global attention began to take shape. It wasn't a story of scandal or superficial intrigue. It was a story of human vulnerability, of courage, of mistakes and reconciliation, and of the quiet power of someone who had learned, through laughter and sorrow alike, to face the truth no matter how painful. Carol's journey was no longer just about performance, it was about survival, reflection, and the willingness to confront secrets that had festered far too long. The shadows of her life were no longer just hers, they were part of a narrative the world was finally ready to hear. The world always knew Carol Burnett as a radiant force of joy, a woman whose laughter seemed endless and whose kindness felt boundless. But as she reflects now, in the soft quiet of her home, age and memory lending weight to every thought, the truth of her story reveals itself in shadows and whispers. There were secrets she kept for decades, moments of regret that no audience ever saw, and tragedies that etched lines into her heart long before the cameras ever caught her smile. Family members lost too soon, friends whose words cut deeper than knives, illnesses that claimed loved ones quietly, and last words that echoed in empty rooms. These were the pieces of a life the world only glimpsed in fragments. She remembers nights when she would sit alone, clutching letters that would never be sent, rereading fragments of conversations she could never fully share, and realizing that even laughter, her greatest gift, could not erase the ache beneath. She thinks of Lucille Ball and Betty Davis, of Julie Andrews and Dick Van Dyke, of moments of camaraderie shadowed by unspoken truths, and wonders how many others carry their own hidden burdens behind the veneer of brilliance. Hollywood, with its glitz and glamour, could celebrate talent but often failed to acknowledge humanity, and Carol had lived in that space, navigating the joy, the sorrow, and the silent betrayals that came with it. In the telling of this story, she uncovers a deeper understanding of herself, a reconciliation between the public and private, the laughter and the tears. Every secret confronted, every regret named, every loss mourned has shaped her into the woman who could stand resilient in the spotlight while carrying the weight of her private world. And though some truths are bitter, some memories unbearable, there is a strange beauty in the survival of spirit, in the courage to speak even when the words tremble, in the grace of a life fully, painfully lived. As the final lights dim on this story, Carol Burnett sits in quiet reflection, the echoes of applause mingling with memories of heartbreak, laughter entwined with sorrow, and the vast, intricate tapestry of a life that touched millions. She has learned that while the world may remember her for comedy, it is in the shadows, in the unspoken truths, and in the enduring strength to face every loss and every betrayal that her legacy truly resides. And in that knowledge, there is both peace and a haunting, beautiful poignancy, the story of a woman who gave laughter to the world, while holding an ocean of truth quietly within.